Welcome to the Facts Verse podcast. Our guest today is a journalist and best-selling author, David Sheff. As a journalist, he's written for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Playboy, others like that. He's interviewed heads of state, rock stars, movie stars, you name it. But after an illustrious career, or during an illustrious career as a journalist, he has managed to surpass it as an author and an advocate. He's perhaps best known for his book, Beautiful Boy, A Father's Journey Through His Son's Addiction, which is a New York Times #1 bestseller. And many of you may have seen the movie that came from it, starring Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet. And in the years since that book, he's become a leading advocate for mental health and as it relates to addiction. But we're not here to talk about that today. He has released more recently a biography of Yoko Ono. And it is a just lovely, well-crafted and insightful book about this legendary figure. And so we're going to talk to him about Yoko and her relationship with John, her art, and her, very, very long life and career. So please welcome David Sheff.
Thank you so much for doing this, for having me. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much for being here. One of the things that is most notable right away about this biography as compared to most other biographies is that Yoko is a longtime friend of yours. You just don't get that level of closeness, I think, from most biographers. But I would imagine, and we'll definitely talk about, how you guys met and your sort of now famous long interview with John and Yoko. But I just was curious when you were setting out to write this book, and a lot of it was based off this interview. You had a lot of material ready. How much hemming and hawing did you do about, like, should I write this? Am I too close? Or must I write this because I'm so close? And how many times did you say, no, I'm not going to do it? Yes, I am. No, what was that process?
Well, there was a lot of, no, I'm not going to do it. Yes, I am. I mean, for sure. You've got that right. It was really tricky for me because, I've interviewed many, many people, but really Yoko's the only one who I've gotten this close to. And part of that was because of the circumstances, in which I met her, which, I guess we'll talk about when
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
with John and with her and John. Um, But yeah, writing about a friend was really tricky, and I decided to do it because I felt that part of what would be interesting in my writing about Yoko, as opposed to other people, potential other biographers, is that I did know her so well and did have that long-term relationship with her. But at the same time, I'm a journalist, and I really wanted to tell the truth. I wasn't going to tell some whitewashed version of the story. Uh, and I really wanted, I really wrestled with whether I could pull it off or not. Um, One of the things that helped me in making that decision was just knowing about Yoko and John. Both of them were really devoted to. I mean, they talked about everything. They were not secretive. They were very open about the worst stuff that ever happened to them. About their drug use, about the problems in their relationship. So it wasn't like they were keeping secrets like maybe a lot of big movie or rock stars or other people that prominent might be. Um, and so in some ways, I felt John has a song "Give Me Some Truth." Yoko has in one of Yoko's songs, she says, "I want the truth and nothing more." And I sort of felt they're kind of giving me in a weird way permission to go there and to tell the truth. At the same time, bringing into it some of the insights I have that only because I got to know her so well, and also uh, taking advantage of the fact that because of our relationship, I was able to talk to people who otherwise would not have worked with a biographer, including Yoko's family. Her son Sean Lennon, her daughter Kyoko uh, Ono, her brothers. I met her brother when I was in Tokyo, and I mean a lot of other people in her family only talked to me because of my relationship with Yoko, and they would call up Yoko's office and say, is this something that uh, she feels comfortable with me doing? And and in every case, they gave the go ahead.
That's great. Yeah, and as a reader, I feel like, at least my experience was like, there's a layer of trust, when you write something and that this happened or this is how Yoko felt or whatever, like, as a reader, I go, well, I believe that because, especially because you talked to her about this, like not in connection to the book, you just talked to her about this or things like that, where you go, oh, okay, it added a layer of trust to me. Not that every biography has to have that. You can certainly write great bios without knowing them, but yeah, it was a very cool thing, and I found myself constantly like reiterating that in my mind, like, oh right, this was a person who really knows Yoko, which is so cool. Um,
So,
so talk about a little bit. You were writing for Playboy, and I can't remember. Did you pitch this as a potential interview, or did you get assigned it?
well, I was in the office of the Playboy editor. I was only 24, and I was kind of really trying to write for Playboy and Rolling Stone, a lot of big magazines. I'd done a lot of local music writing in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I sort of stormed my way into the editor's office at Playboy and chastise him that I don't know where my confidence came from, but for a moment it was there. And I said, because I'd written him a million letters, I'd written a lot of suggestions, and he never had responded. And basically, he told me, relax, sit down, let's talk. And he gave me an interview assignment to interview John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, who at the time were making the Blues Brothers movie. And so I was thrilled. But as I was leaving, because I'd done interviews with a lot of musicians. Uh, the guy Barry Golson asked me, "By the way, do you have any way to get to John Lennon?" And I didn't, but I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it," and I was thrilled. And that's how I got the assignment. I didn't pitch it; it sort of came out of the blue, and it was one of those magic moments because it turned out if it had been a month earlier, there's no way Yoko and John would have done the interview. But I happened to pitch it to them at a time that they had decided to release a record after they hadn't done anything public for about 5 years, and so they decided to do that. They wanted to publicize it, and so they agreed.
Yeah, that's amazing. The timing of it all, and then so then I talk a little bit, and you talk about this in the book about the test, the conditions that Yoko demanded on before she'd let you talk to her.
Yeah, she was. I wrote letters to a lot of people and sent faxes and even telegrams in those days to people who I thought might have connections to get to Yoko. And I reached out to a producer randomly who I knew through another uh, story I'd done. And I said, if there's any way you could get this to Yoko, I'd be grateful. I got a call one day from a guy who asked me when I was born and where I was born. And he said that he was representing Yoko, and I didn't know if he was telling the truth or not, but I told him, and I was born in Boston. I was born December 23rd, 1955. And the next day I got a call from the same guy saying that Yoko had done my astrological and numerological charts. And based on those, she agreed to meet with me. And, I should come to New York. And I did. I got on the next plane. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. I flew from LA to New York. And the next day was sitting across from Yoko in her office.
At that point, were you or have you ever been into that sort of thing, or was that a completely foreign notion?
No, I was not into. I mean, I always made fun of that all that stuff. I mean, a lot of the sort of spiritual kinds of things and horoscopes and numerology. And Yoko also was a tarot card reader. In fact, when I sat with her, even as we were discussing whether or not she would agree to do the interview, she was flipping her tarot cards on the table in front of her, reading me, I guess, reading our vibe, whatever it was. And so for me, it was all new kind of woo-woo stuff that was a little strange, but ultimately, I guess the stars and the numbers and the tarot all worked in my favor because she agreed to go forward.
That's amazing. What talk about a nerve-wracking moment. You're sitting there, she's flipping over cars. She like, I might be sent on the next plane back. This may not work.
That's right.
Um, and then and I think as you mentioned, it was because they were sort of allowing themselves to be a little bit more public because they had an upcoming release, so they were a little bit more open. Obviously, the tarot cards and the astrological sign, it worked in your favor. But even with that, they I don't even know it seemed like from the book you were almost just sort of like, "Okay, I guess you're just letting me be here for many days. Oh, no, it's a week, it's 2 weeks, it's 3 weeks." Like, like kind of out of the because as a, journalist, you would expect, maybe you get a few hours,
Yeah.
at a very like, a controlled setting and things like that. But very quickly you started probably began to realize like, "Oh, this is like a real they are letting me hang."
Yeah. Uh, I've done hundreds of interviews with people of that, big movie stars and big rock stars and artists and all. And rarely since then, but up until that point, no one had ever opened up their lives in the way that Yoko and John did. Uh, yeah, most interviews were, I'd get a couple hours. A publicist would be hovering by,
Yeah.
escorting me out the second the time was up, trying to even censor the kinds of questions I would ask. But no, I was invited into their home, into the recording studio. It became a routine. The first time I met them, it was at a coffee house right near their house, and I sat there and we had coffee together. And John said something about, our lives are open. Ask us anything you want. And I took him up on it, and still didn't know what was gonna happen. But I was told the next day to meet them again in the morning at their apartment building, the Dakota in New York. I did that. We had breakfast in their kitchen, and then I went with them to the recording studio. And there was a routine that began that day that pretty much was how things went after that. I was with them every single day while they were recording Double Fantasy, and I watched them in the studio, and I watched them singing, and I watched John when we would come back to the apartment. John would rush home because he wanted to see his son Sean, who at the time was 4. And I was with them back at the apartment. I would go with Yoko down to her office, which was on the first floor of the Dakota. And as she was doing business and making phone calls and deciding, what record label to work with and all kinds of things like that, I sat there and I was like a fly on the wall for that as well. Um, and that went on for 3 weeks. And it was amazing to be able to, it was amazing because of that much time. I was able to ask, everything I wanted to ask, able to do follow ups, and also able to observe them in their, people have said that period of time they weren't getting along, or they were, even some people have speculated, they were on the way to a divorce, and they were, they put this public front on to, convince the public that everything was fine. If I'd been with them a couple hours, they might have been able to, fool me like that. But because I was with them every single day for so much time, I really saw them together all the time, and saw them individually as well. And I saw the truth. I saw what was going on in their relationship. I saw how much they cared about each other. I saw how much they were enjoying working together on their records. The one that became Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey is what they were working on at the time. And so, uh, 3 weeks was a good. I watched them record some of the great songs. I'll hear a song on the radio or something, and I'll be brought back to sitting in the recording studio in the corner on a director's chair that they gave me to watch them record, and John would be behind the glass control, in the control room. Yoko would be on the other side of the glass in front of a microphone singing over and over again. So it was really, really something. It was, again, I was really young, and so my mind was kind of blown. I mean, I was excited to be doing an interview for Playboy. I was excited to be on an expense account and staying in a really fancy hotel in
Yeah.
New York. And then I'm sitting with, with John and Yoko for all these weeks.
I mean, it very much now that you, like, play it out like that, it has very much of the, Almost Famous movie, vibe
Gosh,
of the young Cameron Crowe, just all of a sudden thrown into this, which
it
is
really
so
was. It really had that. I just read Cameron's Crowe's autobiography, which just came out this week, I think.
oh, cool.
And there was a lot of similarities. I mean, he was doing it. I was with John and Yoko. He was with David Bowie and Led Zeppelin, but it was very similar.
That's amazing, and so I would assume, like, even at the as they were so gracious and kind at the front, at the beginning of it, that you were probably pretty nervous. I mean, was there a point where you kind of felt a little bit like, more at ease? Like, okay, now I can settle in and really observe, really ask the questions. I don't know if that's day 4 or something like that.
Yeah, I was nervous for sure. I'd never, nothing like this. And it was also, this was, John and Yoko. I mean, they were bigger than life figures. And I had grown up, kind of obsessed with the Beatles and especially with John's solo music. I came to Yoko's music and art later, but I would sit across from them, and it was just so easy talking. And then all of a sudden, there was a moment where John was talking about a trip that he had taken at one point to Spain, to Almeria, Spain, and he was telling a story about it. And he said, "Oh, but while I was there, by the way, I wrote Strawberry Fields." And I was
Like,
like,
come on.
that's when moment when I would be reminded, "Oh yeah, this is who I'm sitting here talking to." And so um, I was nervous, but because of how easy they were and how kind of gracious they were and how open they were, um, and funny and, just welcoming and all this stuff, the nervousness went away. And I think by, certainly by the end of the first week, it was much more casual at that point. And I also realized that I wasn't good. I mean, the other thing is I went there with pages of questions that I'd prepared. And so there was at first some pressure I felt to get through as much as I could. But when I realized I was going to have a lot more time with them, I was able to relax in that way too, to realize that I could do a lot of follow up. I could listen to, I mean, we could talk a lot about any of the one, whether it was about one particular song of theirs or one particular moment in their lives or their childhood or about politics or about, uh, other musicians. I mean, whatever it was, we were able to really go into some depth.
Yeah, and I'm also struck by, I mean, they had every reason in the world, to be distrusting of whoever, you know what I mean? Like, as most people who are, like, uber famous, like, you gotta have a layer of protection just for yourself and your sanity, and it's kind of remarkable that they just seemed so willing to just, they're just so open and kind and bringing you in, and you didn't know them, it's not like or, you weren't their nephew. There were, it was like there's no reason beyond sort of a basic level of trust, and obviously you must have, had that coming out of you of like, you can trust me, like, you must not have seemed like you were going to be, make it a hatchet job or anything like that. And so, but it's kind of amazing that because they were so famous, and there were so many people who were trying to get to them and critique them and all that. It's
Yeah,
pretty remarkable they were so trusting.
yeah, that it was remarkable that they were trusting like that. You're absolutely right because it's not only that everybody wanted them, piece of them for sure, especially John, of course. I mean, think about the attention that he had since he was, so young when when the Beatles broke out. But they'd also been treated really poorly by the press. Yoko and John were really sort of vilified. She was vilified, especially in the early days when they got together. Um, and there were a lot of journalists who had written about them or portrayed them on, TV shows, whatever it was, really negatively. So that made it even more extraordinary that they were so open to a journalist coming in that they didn't know, as you point out, and trusting me. And maybe it was partly because they maybe it was maybe it goes back to the tarot cards or something like that, and maybe it was just part of the vibe there. But also, I think a lot of it had to do with just who they were at that time of their lives. They were very, very content and very open, and they'd lived, this very quiet life when they had a child, weren't doing interviews, weren't making records. Yoko wasn't having art openings. They lived a life that was very different than anything they'd ever lived before, and it was really a revelation. I mean, John talks in the uh, book about, or in the interview about, little things that gave him more pleasure than getting all the gold records and platinum records that he'd gotten. Baking a loaf of bread and watching it come out of the oven. Having experience, teaching his young son to swim at the YMCA. I mean, things like that. So they were just in a really good space, and I think maybe that was partly why they were so open and so trusting.
Yeah, I mean, and then obviously then to contrast then what happened, very, very shortly after. And then, I mean, I guess There's so many places I want to go now with this, but maybe we could talk a little bit about, because you talked about how they've been, so many people were so critical of Yoko, and it became almost like culturally and societally kind of okay to bash her. Like it was this weird thing that like not that many people throughout pop culture history and where there's just sort of like it's an acceptable punchline or it's an accept and you're like, especially as you learn more, as I learned from the book more about her life, her passions, her art, her who she is as a person, it's just like, man, was that not deserved? And so I guess for starters, maybe we should go further back. Could you talk to us a little bit about her life, as a child and sort of the ups and downs that she had as a kid through her life as a budding artist?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the way that she was treated was really, I mean, it was appalling. And, I trace a lot of it to misogyny and racism. Um, people, when she first got together with John, would scream out at her to go back to her own country. And they warned John that she was going to slit his throat in the middle of the night. I mean, crazy, crazy, crazy attention. All of which, she wasn't prepared for because, she had an extraordinary backstory, which people don't know about. I mean, she was from Tokyo. Her family was one of the four most prominent families in the whole country. Richest in business, had holdings in banking and shipping and freight and many, many other manufacturing. Uh, she was really kind of treated as a princess, and so she had everything materially. She ended up going to the best schools and having being waited on hand and foot all the time. But at the same time, she was very lonely, and her parents were completely preoccupied with themselves, and she felt really resentful and ignored, and in some ways was really hurt by that. She was always trying to connect with people, and the way that she would connect with people was she'd ring a bell and the servant would bring her tea, and that was sort of like she did it. She said just to see another person. Um, so she had this sort of sadness in her, and she suffered depression. She had intense anxiety. I mean, all of that, and then everything changed for her and her family, when war broke out. I mean, as bad as things were for her before that, uh, of course, it was absolutely hellish at that point. And her family, her father was interned in a concentration camp. Uh, they were in the middle of the bombing of Tokyo. Yoko was with her mother and brother and sister, and they had a bomb shelter and spent the nights in this shelter while Tokyo was being bombed. One night, Yoko was too sick to go into the bomb shelter, and she saw the firebombing of Tokyo from her bed, and it was really traumatic. Finally, the mom evacuated the family up to a farming village, and there, because they'd come from the city, because Yoko had partly been raised in the United States, she'd gone to school a little bit. Her dad was a banker, a big successful banker, and part of the time he was in most of the time he was in Tokyo, but he also spent time in New York, and he brought the family with him. And so Yoko went to some schools in New York. Um, so she went from having this amazing privileged life to being treated incredibly poorly as sort of this person who had come in from the big city and was rich and was privileged. So she was, they as a kid, she just, it was a very, very, very difficult childhood. Um, the war ended. The family came back to Tokyo. Um, Tokyo had been devastated at that point. Yoko was still traumatized, and she talked about coming back to Tokyo and seeing the bombed out city. And all the people, of course, had been killed. There had been the atomic bombs. I mean, she was devastated, as everybody in the country was at that point. But slowly things returned to a kind of normal. She went to school. She still suffered from depression, anxiety. At one point, when she was in high school, she actually tried to take her life. She tried to kill herself. Um, and what she found as a way out of her head, really, her depression and anxiety, whatever it was she was suffering from, was when she finally discovered art. And she, it was a revelation for her. Interestingly, John Lennon talked about discovering, the way music played a role in his own life and helping him with his own depression and his own, struggles growing up. Yoko had that as well. And art, looking at art and making art really changed her. And it gave her a voice, and it gave her recognition, and it gave her a way to process a lot of what she'd been through. So it was in high school, and especially when she then left high school, started college, went to college for a year in Tokyo, and then moved to Sarah Lawrence College in New York, that she really found herself as an artist and musician.
Yeah, but even, there's the story you talked about where she told her father, like, "I'm gonna be a composer." And he was like, "Nah, nah, nah, women don't do that." And it's sort of, "You're gonna be an opera singer, if anything." And so, like, even back then, obviously she was getting sort of the beginnings of the, like, here's what you're not allowed to do. I also, it strikes me is so interesting, and I want to talk about her art, especially in the pre-John era. But your story now, but talking about like that sense of loneliness and having to ring a bell to bring somebody, and her parents being, her dad was largely like not around. He was working in other countries, and her mom. Um, it's an interesting thing to me that so much of her art is meant to be interactive, and is it meant to be like with others, and it's instructions, you do this and do this, and now you can experience this with me, and things like that. I mean, I have to think that there's a through line there of like, I got ignored as a kid, so I'm going to try to bring everybody into my circle with my art.
That's absolutely true. She was trying to connect to people, and um, as you say, most of her art was about. It was participatory art. She wasn't just putting a painting on the wall and letting people either look or not look. She wanted to engage people, and she wanted to engage people because she always wanted to connect. When this was moving much, further into the future, she had a show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and there was a telephone on the wall in the middle of an art exhibit, and every once in a while the phone would ring, and if somebody was inclined, anybody who was visiting the museum could pick up the phone and they'd say hello, and they would hear, hello, hi, this is Yoko, and Yoko would have a conversation with them. I mean, she wanted to touch people. She wanted to connect with people. She wanted to be heard and seen. And it was a lifelong um, uh, passion for her. And it really was a sort of, so much of her art is about touching people and for them to touch her back. And I mean, it was a consistent through line from the very beginning, when she had these instruction pieces where she would tell people to perform these uh, actions. Go outside and listen to the earth turning was one.
A
She,
kitchen piece,
yes,
go throw your food against the wall or against a canvas.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. A lot of it was fun, a lot of it was funny, and then there were some very dark things too. It was, there was some very sort of some things where sometimes she was expressing her very deep pain.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you talk about people can experience it and then touch her, and then some. I mean, what I flashed to was like sometimes literally with this cut piece, which you open the book with, talking about this piece where people were invited to come up and like cut her garments off, and then there was several instances of it where it became like people crossing the line. And so, I guess that is the sort of risk that you run if as you have interactive pieces where you're actually like inviting people to get physically close to you. And as such, like I'm struck by like there's a level of, you might call it fearlessness in doing that. And then it's kind of like, but the more I would learn about her as a person and how she was an artist, is like, was she being like overtly brave by doing these sort of interactive and sort of groundbreaking artist pieces that sometimes involve people literally being so close to her that she didn't know? Or is it sort of like, is there a part of her that is like, that's just her personality? She never even thought twice, like, why would this be weird? Like, it's art.
Wow, what a great question. I think the answer may be a combination of those things. I think that some of it, a lot of what her art, what she created, just came from a very instinctive sense of making art. She just made pieces and she got inspired. And I was with her sometimes when I would see her, her mind was working and she would come up with these things. Um, but I think part of it also was maybe a challenge for herself. Cut pieces is a great example. I mean, to invite people to come up onto a stage with a pair of scissors and to cut off her clothes was amazing exercise in trusting the audience. And I think part of it was an experiment to see if she could trust. But also part of it was that she wanted so badly to trust. And that became a theme, another theme throughout her life, wanting to trust people and wanting to trust the world. And, it was related to her politics as well. And one of the amazing things is that, when she did cut piece originally, and she was exposing herself on stage in the way that she did it. She was not well known as an international celebrity. But later in her life, when she performed that piece, and people around her, her family and her bodyguards, they didn't want her to do it. They thought it was incredibly dangerous, incredibly risky, and yet she did. So even then, she allowed people to come up on the stage with a pair of scissors after everything she'd been through, um, and cut off her clothes. So she was. It was challenging to people, challenging to the audience, and also, and it was sort of a wish fulfillment kind of thing too, which she talked about as well. She wanted to trust people, and even if people who told her not to trust people, she still was committed to trying.
Yeah, yeah, and, and if you look even through towards the end of the book, you talk about one of the more recent pieces, the mother appreciation piece, where, the advertisements for it in the piece was like, bare bodies and of, like, women's anatomy, and, it got a lot of backlash, and then even then, Yoko's response was like, "I don't understand why. I wanted to, like, this is what a baby would see when they, enter the world from their mother." And sort of this, like, it's almost like this kind of willful ignorance slash, like, I don't know, man, I'm just putting out art, don't be so mad at me. It's like,
Yeah, that's a great example too. And there was a part of it was a naivete, maybe even, and something that John talked about Yoko having that, and it was sort of this pure way of thinking and trusting, as we were talking about. Um, that when she would get some of the reactions that she got about her personal, about her personally, people criticized the way she looked when she got together with John, and they certainly criticized her art and her music. She would be baffled. She would be stunned. I'm just putting something out there. What are you talking about? You don't get it. People didn't get a lot of it, and she always was, I think, mystified by that. It didn't stop her either, which was pretty amazing. She was fearless in that way, as that's a really good word to describe her. And the way that she could get up in front of an audience, and one of her music, one of the things she got criticized for a lot was the way that she we'll call it, singing, but in a lot of her singing was really vocalizing and screaming and uh, yelling and uh, caterwauling. I mean, all of these things. Uh, And some people got it and they loved it and they were completely moved by it, inspired by it. I mean, people like Laurie Anderson told me that, she inspired them to do similar things on stage. But there were a lot of people who just didn't get it and they hated it. And people criticized her, and it didn't stop her at all. Um, when uh, when Donald Trump was elected the first time, she sent out a tweet, and her. It was an audio recording of her screaming for, I can't remember how long, 90 seconds or something like that. I mean, she had something to say, and some people, you know, didn't like it, of course,
yeah, yeah.
but she didn't care. Uh,
It don't yeah. And, it's music, there's almost a parallel to, okay, if music generally in rock and roll music had been more like a paintings, as traditional still life of fruit and whatever, and then what she was doing was just like somebody throwing paint on a canvas, but that doesn't upset people in the way that vocalization does for some reason, because I think just people were not at all used to hearing it and not maybe thinking of it as more art than it is music.
yeah,
Um, but I guess talk a little bit also about, so she was, people, we could talk about how they met, and I think there is this misconception about like, oh, she was just like, she knew John Lennon, she just wanted to be she was a fan, and she wormed her way into the band, when actually the reverse is true, that he went to her show and she was already making a name for herself, in smaller circles, obviously, than the Beatles. But yeah, talk a little bit about where she was at artistically, and how they met.
Yeah, well, after she left Japan, she came to New York to Sarah Lawrence College. After graduating from Sarah Lawrence, she worked in the Village in New York in a really kind of vibrant, avant-garde, crazy art scene, made a lot of work, and eventually she was invited to come and perform and show her art in London. Um, she was out of this festival and she performed, and then she was offered to a solo show, a one-woman exhibition at an art gallery called Indica, and it was amazing. I've seen a lot of the documentation of that show, and a lot of some of it's very famous. There was an apple on a stand, and the title was Apple, and it was for sale for $50. Um, and there was a ladder that if you climb to the top of the ladder, you're sort of precariously balancing at the top, and there's a magnifying glass hanging there, and you look up at the ceiling, and in microscopic letters, there's the word yes. Um, there was a she called it a sky painting, and it was a television monitor that just was showing them. There was a camera that was showing the sky, and she brought it into the art gallery. Well, she was getting ready for this opening of this show, and it was going to open the next day. And the owner of the gallery allowed someone in because he was so famous, and it was, of course, John Lennon. She was really pissed off because the show wasn't ready yet. But because the owner of the gallery pushed her to do it, she showed John around, and he was able to perform some of her art pieces. And he was really moved by it, really thrilled. And it was at a time in his life when he was very unhappy and he was very cynical about art, he said. Uh, he said that there was so much art that was really negative and smashing pianos and breaking, exploding cars. And, that was what was happening in the avant garde. And Yoko's work was very pure and very kind of beautiful and really positive. And it was all about like that message on the ceiling. It was about yes. It was affirmation, and he was really moved by it. And when he left, he was kind of enchanted by her, and it began a relationship that it didn't. People thought there was somebody who reported that Yoko had chased him out in his when his fancy what was it, his Rolls Royce limousine left or something like that. I mean, none of that was true. They both were very. She was getting ready for the opening. John was working on other things, and they came together again a few weeks later at an art opening. And eventually, they started to correspond and to communicate. And he would call her up, and she sent him a copy of a book that she had written called Grapefruit. It was a collection of some of her art pieces. Um, at one point, he invited her over, and his wife was out of town, and they decided to try to make a recording together, and they did, and they made this kind of wild recording. And that was when they got together the first time. They made love, and that was it, according to the way that they described it. And John talked about it, in other interviews, uh, in mine and other interviews, that he fell madly in love with her, and she fell madly in love with him. And that was the beginning of the end of both of their marriages, but the beginning of the relationship that became, this dynamic, creative thing that, the John and Yoko story started at that point.
And so, and she was, so yeah, so she was, and a real up and coming artist, but also not even real. I mean, at that point, I get the sense like she was already influencing people in the art world. And so, she was a name, not as big as John, but but it's sort of this interesting thing and John in the books, he's quoted as saying like, that he was the lesser of the two of them, like artistically, and that she was the sort of like grand artist, and he was just trying to, and she was teaching him. And but right away it feels like she just got sucked into that narrative of like rock star and plus one, and things like that. And I found it so fascinating. I didn't realize that she was such a hugely influential artist even back then. And then now, obviously, years later, she has being sort of understood as being such a huge influence in all sorts of, genres and forms and media and everything like that. So it's I think an important distinction to just that everything that everybody said about this, the way they started and her intentions and everything like that has really just been taken not even out of context, just like just lies.
Yeah, that's right. And people think that when John said that he thought Yoko's work was more important than the Beatles, people thought it was hyperbole at minimum. I mean, he was just trying to promote his wife. He believed it. He really believed it. I mean, she freed him up to try to do everything he did after the Beatles was influenced by Yoko, and that included the music and also art that he did himself. And he totally was inspired by her. And the people that worked with him saw it happen. I talked to some of the people like Klaus Vormann, who was a musician and artist who worked on a lot of the, he worked with the Beatles on a lot of things. And I talked to producers. I talked to other people that were with them during those years. And John was completely enamored of her. And, she inspired him. I mean, he was really unhappy cranking out, as he described it. When people hear that he says that he was cranking out Beatles songs, people who are, obsess about those songs, can't believe that that's the way he's talked about them, but that is the way that he felt. And so when he started to do experimental music, starting with the White Album, the song Revolution #9, I mean, it was completely inspired by Yoko, and that, the work after that was so much of it was inspired by Yoko. Uh, and he, was madly in love with her, but also he saw her as an artist. I mean, he said that she was the most famous artist in the world who nobody knew what she did because people didn't really understand her work and didn't see her work. She was, as you say, the plus one. She said that part of the reason that they eventually had a separation, and part of the reason was because she was so tired of being Mrs. Lennon, whereas she was an artist in her own right.
Yeah, and it's we talk about how many major artists and musicians and people have talk about her now as just this like towering figure in art. And I was thinking, she was so um varied in the types of, there was no, she wasn't just a painter, like she was doing all sorts of arts and forms and media and whatever. And I wonder, and I think you might even talk about that, like maybe because she did so many things that didn't focus on one thing, like it kept her from being seen as like so influential. But I also wonder if like because of that, then like has the pendulum swung back that much harder because now everybody can look at her life and be like, whoa, she was influential in this and this and this and this, and it's sort of like now she gets even more respect because she didn't get it then.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. It's partly why I finally decided, after going back and forth, like we talked about writing the book, that I wanted to put it all together in one place so that people could see how influential she was in so many different spheres. And the fact that she has had all these retrospectives around the world, um, where her art has been brought together and where the pieces that were hung on the wall were mixed with the pieces that were interactive, which most of them, were in different ways, um, it's sort of a vindication in a way that people are seeing this breadth of her art and how influential she was, and also kind of getting it for the first time. I've talked to people who gone to her shows. It was in Chicago, and before that, it was in Germany, and before that, it was in London. This the most recent retrospective that was this really amazing. I think they had 200 pieces of hers in the show, and people went because of curiosity, maybe because Yoko was famous. She was again Mrs. Lennon, and they came away completely. Uh, they got it. They understood what John saw in her work, and why the art world has finally caught on. Um, the reviews of her shows have reflected that. I mean, she's gotten attention everywhere by the big art critics and people largely. I mean, there's some people that still dismiss her. I read one review where they talked about her art as being hippie art, but most of the attention that she's gotten, and I don't think she'd even object to that, by the way, because I think she was kind of proud of that. But most of the attention she's gotten has been from people who have seeing it for how important it is and how moving it is and how inspiring it is.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Even like you talk about like the critical reception, even for her music, and has always been pretty great. I mean, occasionally there are people who don't get. It was just like the bigger pop culture, like the cultural reception wasn't as good for the varied reasons. But at least there was throughout. There have been people who at least got it somewhat.
Yeah, there were people that got it, and they were mostly people who really were connected to the alternative art worlds, the avant-garde, both in music, sort of the I mean, people that I talked to for the in both the art world and the music world who talked about Yoko as an influence were the people who I think we would all consider sort of the artier side of whatever, the more fringe, experimental side of the art of the music world. People like Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon, the Sonic Youth, and David Byrne, and and then in the art world, people like Ai Weiwei. I mean, a lot of people who are themselves doing incredibly cutting edge work are the ones who really, I think, got it. And it was true of reviewers as well. Some of the early reviewers for some of the music magazines dismissed her completely and thought that she was, and the New York Times, I mean, they thought that they didn't get it at all. But then there were the ones who were connected to to the sort of the cutting edge again, who saw her for what she was, which was really, on the edge of what was coming and
Yeah.
how influential it was.
How much of the hatred towards her would you think is like sexism and anti-Japanese sentiment and racism, and then how much of it was, "I think you're breaking up my favorite band." Like that, like simple as that.
Yeah, a lot of both. I think that there was a lot of attention. The people loved, I mean, in ways that we all know about how people felt about the Beatles, and the perception that Yoko broke up the Beatles is something that haunted her forever. And I still will talk to people about Yoko after having spent all these years knowing her and then writing a book about her. And that's what I hear from so many people. Yeah, Yoko broke up the Beatles, and first of all, she didn't. I mean, as I write about in there, I mean, I John Lennon was the one who famously broke up the Beatles. As I say in the book, Yoko actually might have been responsible for the fact that they stayed together longer than they otherwise might have, because John had a foot out the door at that period of time from the Beatles, and Yoko held his hand, accompanied him to a lot of those recording sessions, really took care of him, and he might have left earlier than he did. Um, but at the same time, a lot of the attacks on her were very specific about her sex and about her history, her Japanese ancestry, and the fact that I mean, a lot of it was completely racist. I mean, people talking about the way she looked, and people were racist again. I mean, after the war, there was a lot
Yeah.
of racism against Japan and Japanese citizens. Um, so she experienced both. And also sexism. I mean, a lot of the attention that she got from within the Beatles organization, she was really dismissed. She talked about how she and John were together and really firmly together at this point, and a Beatles manager or assistant would come into the room and talk to John and completely ignore the fact that she was sitting there with him in bed, and she didn't exist. Uh, and so John even talked about his own sexism uh, when John's great song, of course, that I mean, there's a lot of examples of this, but, I tell the story of the song Imagine. Yoko came yeah, yeah, John ended up saying that Yoko was the one who inspired that song and co-wrote the lyrics to that song with him. At the time, he didn't give her any credit. It was listed as a John Lennon song. Now it's been reviewed, and now it is listed among the music publishing organization, whatever it's called, that it's a song by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. But John said, you don't give the wife credit, even if she's sitting there and contributing. So there was the sexism that came even from John at that point.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk a little bit to pivot slightly about this. I mean, I guess it might have been well known. It was news to me about this whole, issue with her daughter and not being not being able to find her and all this, like, this is like incredibly compelling others and tragic other side of her life, having nothing really to do with her art, and John. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when Yoko was in Japan, she was married. She married this guy who was an American filmmaker. His name was Tony Cox, and they had a daughter whose name was Kyoko. Uh, Yoko at the time was not interested in being a mother. She was interested in being an artist. And so Yoko didn't spend a lot of time with her daughter, and she did not. I mean, the father, Tony, was the one who really raised Kyoko for the earliest years. Then, when Yoko got together with John, Tony essentially kidnapped Kyoko and stopped Yoko from seeing her daughter. Uh, by then, Yoko was much more connected to Kyoko, and really, it was incredibly painful for her. And it wasn't only that he didn't allow visitation. He didn't. They really disappeared. He was so paranoid because he thought that the John and Yoko machine, being as wealthy as they could, as they were, having all the lawyers, being able to hire private detectives, which they did. Um, so he went underground, and it was Kyoko's life was amazing. She told me about it, and it was incredibly emotional. And she was in tears talking about growing up in cults and having no contact with her mom, and she wasn't, even when she was old enough to reach out to her mother, she didn't do it because the dad said that because he had kidnapped Kyoko, he said that she would have him arrested and thrown in jail, and she didn't want her dad to be thrown into jail. So Yoko spent a couple decades without any contact with her daughter, and it broke her heart. I mean, she created a lot of art and music for her daughter, uh, and it was only much much later that Kyoko finally reached out to Yoko. Well after Yoko was widowed, when John was killed, and now they have an amazing relationship. But Yoko suffered enormously because of that. It was she lost her daughter. The pain was enormous. I mean, you can hear this there's a song called "Don't Worry, Kyoko," and it's Yoko crying and screaming out for her daughter. And I think it goes on for whatever 19 minutes or something like that, and you could really feel the pain, and the pain was genuine.
Yeah, yeah, and then and which is perhaps a natural pivot to another of the most public and horrible, painful things, which is of course John getting killed. I think I touched on it at the very beginning, which is that for you this was an amazing coincidence that because your article was meant to come out later in the year, and then they pushed it forward, and then you were talking to them. They were excited. They were, and you guys were. I think you were going sort of song by song, and you're like, okay, let's. And they were like, come back, and we'll keep talking about song to song. So you had made plans, and then was the next day, John was killed.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. It was the interview. My editor sent an advance copy of the interview over to them at the Dakota in New York. I was back in LA, and I was a Sunday, December 7th, 1980, and I got a call, and it was Yoko and John calling. They were on extension phones, and they were thrilled with the interview itself, but they were also excited about the fact that their Double Fantasy had been released and it was really doing well. There were some really early reviews, and the album was selling well. They were just excited about life. And we talked about the fact that we would get together again to finish doing this song by song analysis of their work together. And then the next time I would come to New York. The next day, I was home watching the Monday night football game, and it was interrupted by the announcer uh, uh, announcing the fact that John had been shot and killed. And I was like everybody, completely blown away, shocked, just horrified, disbelieving. And I instantly got on the phone and tried to call Yoko, and I couldn't reach her. I couldn't get through. And I got on a plane and went back to New York. And I went to see her that first morning when I arrived, but I couldn't even get near the Dakota building because there were so many people. I mean, there were hundreds and then thousands, eventually many thousands of people who gathered there to mourn John's death. And it was only about a week later that I finally went and saw Yoko and saw, the most devastated, sad person I'd ever been around. And we cried together. And um, And Yoko went forward and did a lot of the stuff we've talked about, in music and in art. And she had a life, and she had other relationships, and she became very close to her children, both her daughter Kyoko, who we were talking about, and Sean. But she never really got over the murder of her husband. I mean, she never did, and she was traumatized by it. He was her best friend, her partner, her husband, her lover. I mean, all of those things. And of course, the other part of it is that she was standing by his side when he was shot and killed, and it was something that she never fully recovered from.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, how could you really? I mean, it would be odd if she if she did.
Yes,
But like so much of the trauma, and you talk about, she was able. She has an amazing capability to take loss and anger and sadness and turn it into art. Whereas so many other people would probably turn it into so many other destructive and not great things. I mean, obviously, she and John had, and there was a history of drug use and things like that. So it's not like she was just a teetotaler. But it struck me as almost like their drug use was almost for with different reasons, like recreational or expansion or whatever, or even just coping with the world around them, as opposed to just like that deep sorrow that she felt. Then she would move into art. Um, which I guess then that has been her way, because if she has not gotten over it, then therefore like every piece of art that she's made in the last 40 years has had that under it, which is sort of like feeding her as the engine. Um, you know, yeah. Um, I
it's
guess so then, yeah, go ahead.
well. All I was going to say is the fact that she went back into the recording studio so soon after
Yes, yes.
she left. I mean, she was criticized for that. People said, "How can you go back and be making music, in the recording studio so soon? You should be in mourning." And as Sean Lennon said to me, that was her mourning. That's the way she mourned, was to go into this studio and make the album that would become Season of Glass, which was an album about her anger and about her sorrow. I mean, it is really a beautiful album, I think, but also really hard to listen to because it is filled with so much sadness and so much anger about the fact that John was killed. Um, and that is the way that she processed John's death, as much as she ever could.
Yeah, and hard to look at, even that image of his glasses,
Yeah.
on the cover of that art is shot, it's like, "Oh my god." Um, and so, then you, of course, as we talked about, you were not just a journalist and, reporting on her and them, like, you've kind of swung the other way of like, "Okay, I'm also, like, a friend," and have been a friend for her. I mean, are you guys still in touch? Is this as an ongoing friendship?
I've been in touch, recently. She's kind of retired now, and I've not been in touch with her since she moved up full time to away from the Dakota up to be in upstate New York, which is where she lives now. But I'm in touch with Sean and Kyoko, and I get reports on how she's doing from them, and the fact that they're all really close has been really pretty wonderful. But she's 92 years old.
Right.
She was still making music and still screaming on stage when she was in her 80s. And so, it's pretty extraordinary that she's lived such a long time and has created so much. Um, and It's really something that she is. I mean, as Kyoko said, now she's living a very quiet, private life right now. And as Kyoko said, here's somebody who devoted her life to peace, and she finally has some peace, which is really gratifying.
Yeah, that's lovely to put it that way. Do you have the sense that the longer we get, the further away we get from the Beatles era, the more people will like and respect and think of her art even 100 years from now or whatever.
I do. I do. Although, as I said before, I still hear from people who tell me, in spite of the fact that she's created all this work and it's been out there and it's gotten good attention, and it's her art has traveled, her music has been repackaged in box sets, and people have raved about it. They still talk about her breaking up the Beatles. So in some ways, I kind of wonder if that will ever end. But at the same time, I think that she's now firmly established. So some of her works are really well known. Pieces like Cut Piece, some of the work that she did with John on Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey, the fact that she was the co-writer of Imagine and of Give Peace a Chance. I mean, I think those things will stay as part of her legacy, and I think people will remember that. Um, there still are other art is still being released. She still is really, really, relevant. And another way that I think she'll stay really relevant is that because of so many of the people that influenced were influenced by her, acknowledge that, and they talk about what an important figure she was in art and music.
Yeah. And then obviously was such an important part of your life and you of hers. Obviously, you guys sounds like there was a real reciprocal, relationship of being there for each other during good times, but then in particular hard times for both of you, which is obviously an amazing thing to have started off of an astrological reading, and then now, however many years later, you can really regard her as someone you have spent a lot of time with and really cherish. So I think we'll end it there. And I just thank you so much for talking with us. This has been very, very cool. I'm so glad I got a chance to learn so much more about Yoko and about her life and her work and her art and yes, the relationship with John and everything. It's a really, really brilliant book, and it's so in depth because of the nature of your relationship, and you were there, which is so cool. So thank you for writing it, and thanks for letting us talk to you.
Oh God, well, thank you so much. It was really a great pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for all the thoughtful questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much.